Walter Greene had spent his entire life building a reputation that could not easily be questioned. He was a man of service, of discipline, and of family. At 80 years old, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had given everything he could to his country and then poured the rest of himself into the people he loved most. To those who knew him in Brookhaven, Mississippi, Walter was not just a neighbor or a fellow parishioner. He was a cornerstone. He had fought in wars far from home, sleeping in mud and sand, marching under foreign skies, carrying the weight of duty on his back. When he returned, he did what many veterans dream of but not all accomplish. He built a stable, loving home. For more than 5 decades, he lived in the same modest house on the edge of town with his wife Margaret and their 4 children. Together, they were a family admired by those around them. People described the Greenes as disciplined, respectful, and close-knit. For years, they looked like the perfect example of the American dream: church on Sundays, family dinners on holidays, children growing up to become hard-working adults. Walter was never one for speeches. He preferred to show his love through action. When a neighbor's fence fell during a storm, he was the first to show up with tools in hand. When a young man down the street struggled to find work, Walter sat him down, looked him in the eye, and gave the kind of advice that only comes from decades of living. In the evenings, you could find him on his porch, sipping coffee or sweet tea, nodding at the passing cars, greeting old friends as they strolled by. His children would stop in after work or bring the grandkids on weekends. For Walter, those simple moments, quiet laughter on the porch, the sight of his children gathered under one roof, were the proof that his sacrifices had been worth it. But every family has its secrets. And some secrets lie so deep that no one dares to imagine they could ever surface. For Walter, the truth came not through whispered confessions or careless slips of the tongue, but through something far more mundane: a birthday gift. On the evening of his 80th birthday, his youngest daughter, Jasmine, handed him a small box wrapped in shiny blue paper. She was always the thoughtful one, the free spirit who brought energy into every room. With a mischievous smile, she told him it was something fun, something to help them learn more about their roots. Inside the box was a DNA testing kit, the kind you mail off to trace ancestry or connect with distant relatives. Walter chuckled as he pulled it out. "Girl, I already know where I come from," he said with a smile. To him, the Greene name, the porch he sat on, the town that had embraced him, that was heritage enough. But he loved his daughter, and he saw how excited she was. So, he swabbed his cheek, sealed the sample, and set the kit aside. It was a novelty, nothing more. Weeks passed. The package was mailed, the test forgotten. Life in Brookhaven carried on as it always had. Morning walks. Sunday church. Margaret humming in the kitchen while dinner simmered. His children dropping by, bringing news of their busy lives. Walter had no reason to expect that the small cardboard box would do anything more than tell him something he already knew: that his family tree ran deep in Mississippi soil. But when the envelope arrived, when he finally tore it open at his kitchen table, coffee steaming beside him, his entire world shifted. The results were clear, written in cold, clinical language. For Walter, it was like reading a foreign tongue at first: percentages, genetic markers, matches. But then, as he traced the page with his finger, his eyes landed on the section labeled Immediate Family. His name was there, listed as the subject. But beneath it, where the matches for his children should have appeared, the numbers told a different story. 0%. Not one of his 4 children, David, Lisa, Marcus, or Jasmine, shared his DNA. Walter sat frozen in his chair. He read the words again and again, as though repetition could force them to change. He thought of David, his eldest son, the one who mirrored him in both looks and temperament. He thought of Lisa, who carried Margaret's warmth but his same quiet strength. He thought of Marcus, the charmer, always able to lighten the darkest moment with a joke. And Jasmine, his baby, the one who had given him this test in the first place. They were his children. He had taught them to ride bikes, disciplined them when they broke curfew, held them close when life dealt them harsh blows. He had been there for every scraped knee, every graduation, every heartbreak. And yet, on paper, they were strangers to him. The room felt colder, the silence heavier. Walter's hand trembled as he folded the report and set it down. His mind raced with questions, but one name echoed louder than the rest: Margaret. His wife of 50 years. The woman who had shared his bed, his prayers, his entire adult life. Had she known? Had she lied? The test results were more than just numbers on a page. They were an accusation. That night, Walter waited in the living room for Margaret to return from a church meeting. When she walked through the door, she was greeted not by her husband's usual warmth but by a silence that pressed down like a weight. Walter handed her the paper without a word. She glanced at it, her brow furrowing in confusion. Then she shook her head, pushed it back across the table. "These things are never accurate," she said quickly. "It doesn't mean anything." But Walter had seen her eyes. He had seen the flicker of panic, the flash of recognition. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice low, steady. "Not again." It was the first crack in the foundation of a family that had stood for 50 years. And it would not be the last. The Greene household, once a symbol of unity and love in a quiet southern town, was about to become the stage for a tragedy that no one could have predicted. A tragedy born not from sudden rage or fleeting impulse, but from secrets buried so deep they had become part of the family's very walls. For Walter Greene, the man who had given everything, the discovery would ignite a chain of events that ended in bloodshed. And as the story unfolded, one question lingered. What happens when the truth you've built your entire life on crumbles before your eyes? Brookhaven, Mississippi was not the kind of place that made national headlines. It was a quiet southern town, tucked away from highways and cities, a place where life moved at a slower rhythm. The streets were lined with weathered houses, each porch carrying the memories of families who had lived there for generations. The neighbors all knew one another, if not by name, then by sight, and it was the sort of town where a stranger stood out immediately. Gossip traveled faster than cars, and yet people valued the sense of community, the comfort of familiarity. In this town, Walter Greene stood as a figure who seemed almost immovable. For decades, people looked at him as proof that stability still existed in a world that often felt chaotic. He was the man who had worn the uniform, defended the flag, and then come home to live the American dream in its simplest form: a house, a wife, and 4 children to carry on the family name. Walter was not flashy. His life was built on discipline, not extravagance. He rose early, walked the same path around his neighborhood each morning, and kept his home in perfect order. His yard was always trimmed, his tools always stored neatly, his truck always running smoothly. To many of the younger men in Brookhaven, he was a role model, a living example that hard work and honor could sustain a man through the decades. The town respected him because he never demanded it. He carried himself with quiet authority. If a debate broke out at the local diner, Walter's opinion often ended the argument, not because he shouted louder, but because his words carried weight. People listened when he spoke, and when he chose silence, his silence spoke volumes. But for Walter, life's true reward was not the respect of the town. It was the family he and Margaret had built together. The Greene family was his pride, his anchor. He often described his children as his heart walking outside his body. There was David, the eldest son, who at 48 was considered by many to be his father's reflection. Strong, steady, and dependable, David had spent much of his youth helping Walter with yard work, car repairs, and any chore that required sweat and patience. Walter saw in David a continuation of his own values, and for years he leaned on him as the right-hand man of the household. Next was Lisa, at 46, who carried a nurturing presence. She was a mother herself, the one who worked hardest to keep family traditions alive. Holidays, birthdays, Sunday dinners, Lisa made sure no one forgot their importance. She was her mother's daughter in many ways, echoing Margaret's warmth, but Walter always felt that Lisa carried some of his quiet resilience as well. Then came Marcus, the middle son, 3 years younger than Lisa. Outgoing, confident, and quick with a smile, Marcus had a way of drawing people to him. He could dissolve tension with a joke, lighten even the heaviest of moods. Walter admired him for that. Though Marcus chose a path different from his father's, pursuing business ventures and social circles outside Brookhaven, Walter took pride in his son's ability to stand out. And finally, there was Jasmine, the youngest, at 38. To Walter, she was always the baby of the family, no matter how old she grew. Creative, energetic, and fiercely loyal, she was his favorite, though he never said it aloud. Jasmine had a way of making her father laugh, reminding him of the joy in small things. She often sat with him on the porch, talking about the past, listening to his stories, sharing her dreams. In those moments, Walter felt complete. The Greene family's bond was admired by the town. People often pointed to them as an example of what a strong, faithful household could look like. Margaret was the glue, known for her cooking and her steadfast faith. Neighbors described her as a blessing, a woman who could soften any hardship with kindness. Together, She and Walter had raised their children with values that emphasized discipline, loyalty, and love. Yet beneath this carefully built image, fractures had existed for years. They were small, hidden, and ignored, but they were there. Walter's military service had taken him away from home for long stretches of time. While he was overseas, Margaret bore the weight of raising the children alone. She managed the household, the finances, the day-to-day struggles, while Walter fought battles she could not see. For decades, he assumed that sacrifice had only strengthened their marriage. What he did not know was that during those absences, choices had been made that would one day unravel everything. By the time Walter reached his 80th birthday, he had convinced himself that life had rewarded him for his sacrifices. He had a stable marriage, grown children who loved him, and the respect of his community. On the surface, his world looked unshakable. To those who passed by the Greene home, it was a picture of endurance. To Walter himself, it was proof that his life had meaning. This illusion, however, was fragile. It depended on secrets remaining buried. And secrets have a way of surfacing, often at the most unexpected moment. When Jasmine gave her father the DNA kit, she thought it would be fun, a small gesture, a way of connecting with the past. Walter accepted it with amusement. He believed his roots were right where he sat, in Brookhaven, in his children's laughter, in Margaret's steady presence. But the test did not care about feelings, memories, or decades of love. The test cared only for biology. And biology told a story that contradicted everything Walter believed about himself and his family. As the truth began to seep into Walter's world, the very foundations of his identity cracked. He was no longer just a veteran, a respected elder, a husband, a father. He was a man forced to confront the possibility that his entire life had been built on a lie. In Brookhaven, people still waved to him, still greeted him with the same warmth. But inside the Greene home, silence began to spread. Conversations grew shorter, glances sharper. Walter carried the weight of the DNA report like a stone in his chest, and Margaret's dismissals only deepened the wound. To outsiders, the Greene family remained the same. But inside those walls, trust had fractured. And once trust is gone, a family's image can collapse overnight. What made Walter Greene's story so haunting was not just the discovery itself, but the way it stripped away his entire identity. For 80 years, he believed he knew who he was and what he had built. Now, for the first time, he questioned whether anything he held dear had ever been real. The town of Brookhaven would soon learn that when the foundation of a man's life crumbles, the collapse does not happen quietly. It sends shockwaves, through his home, through his family, and through the community that once admired him. And those shockwaves would end in tragedy. Walter Greene never imagined that the moment his life began to unravel would start with something so ordinary. A small cardboard box, a cheek swab, an envelope in the mail. Nothing about these things seemed extraordinary. Yet they carried the weight of a secret powerful enough to destroy the foundation of everything he believed. The kit had been a gift, meant to amuse. His daughter Jasmine had been so proud, her eyes shining as she handed it to him on his 80th birthday. "Daddy, I thought it would be fun," she had said, her voice full of enthusiasm. Walter had laughed at the time, brushing it off as a harmless curiosity. He already knew where he came from, or at least he thought he did. Weeks passed before the results came back. The envelope arrived quietly one afternoon, dropped off by the mailman and placed on the kitchen counter between Margaret's grocery list and a church newsletter. Walter barely noticed it at first. Life went on in its steady rhythm. Morning walks, Sunday services, evenings on the porch. The envelope sat untouched, buried beneath the clutter of everyday living, as though it were waiting for the right moment to strike. That evening, with the house unusually quiet, Walter found himself alone at the kitchen table. Margaret was at a church meeting, and the children were scattered across their own busy lives. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the smell rising in the stillness, and his eyes landed on the envelope. Something about its presence nagged at him, a reminder of Jasmine's gift. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and carefully tore it open. The pages inside were filled with medical jargon and percentages, words that seemed cold and clinical. At first, Walter struggled to make sense of it. His eyes scanned across lines of data until they reached a section labeled Immediate Family Matches. He expected reassurance, confirmation of the lineage he had always taken for granted. Instead, he froze. The names of his children were there: David, Lisa, Marcus, and Jasmine. But beside each one, the report listed a glaring truth. 0%. No biological relation. Walter's hands trembled. He rubbed his eyes, blinked, and read the numbers again, desperate for an error. But the paper did not change. His heart pounded as the words pressed down on him, each line louder than the last. For more than 50 years, he had believed these children were his. He had raised them, provided for them, sacrificed for them. Now, in the space of a single page, everything he thought he knew about his family had been ripped away. The room felt colder, the silence heavier. Walter sat in stunned disbelief, staring at the paper as though it were an enemy. His mind began to wander through the years, replaying old memories in a new and sinister light. Had there been signs? Whispers he ignored? Times when Margaret seemed distant? Explanations that didn't add up? He had always brushed aside his doubts, choosing trust over suspicion. Now he wondered if he had been blind all along. Hours passed with Walter still seated at the table, the report spread before him like an accusation. The clock ticked steadily, but he hardly noticed. The weight of betrayal pressed into his chest, threatening to suffocate him. When Margaret finally returned from church, she found her husband sitting silently in the dim kitchen, his face hard, the paper clenched in his hands. "What's this?" she asked cautiously, setting her purse down. Walter's voice was low, steady, and unfamiliar to her. "Read it." Margaret picked up the report, her eyes scanning quickly. At first, confusion flickered across her face. Then denial. "This doesn't mean anything," she said firmly, pushing the paper back across the table. "These tests aren't always right. You can't believe everything you read." Walter slammed his hand down, the sound echoing through the kitchen. "Don't lie to me, Margaret. Not again." She flinched, startled by the intensity in his voice. "You're their father," she insisted. "You raised them. Blood doesn't change that." But Walter was no longer listening. His world had shifted too far, too fast. Her words could not repair the damage. The numbers were burned into his mind. For the first time in his life, he looked at his wife not as a partner but as a stranger, someone who had hidden a devastating truth for decades. The following day, Walter decided to confront the one person he trusted most, his eldest son, David. He called him over under the pretense of yard work. David, ever dependable, arrived without hesitation. The two men stood side by side in the yard, pulling weeds in silence, until Walter finally spoke. "Come inside. I need to talk to you." At the kitchen table, Walter slid the crumpled report across to his son. David frowned, unfolded the paper, and read quickly. His brow furrowed. "What is this supposed to mean?" "It means," Walter said, his voice trembling, "you're not my son. None of you are." David's eyes widened in disbelief. "Dad, of course I'm your son. This has to be wrong." Walter shook his head, his throat tight with anger and grief. "Look at the paper. 0%. I'm not your father." David pushed the report back toward him, his expression hardening. "You're really going to believe this? Some test from a box." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You're letting this nonsense get in your head." Before Walter could respond, David stormed out, the door slamming behind him. The house was silent once again, but the silence was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating. Margaret had denied the truth. David refused to accept it. But Walter could not ignore it. The report haunted him, the betrayal echoing in every corner of his mind. As the days passed, Walter became consumed by the need for answers. He thought back to the years he had been overseas, the months Margaret had spent alone. He recalled an old friend's warning whispered decades earlier, a suggestion he had dismissed as paranoia. Now, the pieces fit together in ways that made his stomach twist. The Greene family, once his greatest pride, had become a battlefield. Every smile, every word of reassurance felt like a lie. Walter's home was no longer a refuge. It was a crime scene of hidden truths. And the man who had always defined himself by discipline and control felt those qualities slipping away, replaced by anger, confusion, and despair. The discovery of the DNA results was not just a revelation. It was the spark that lit a fuse. And once lit, there was no stopping the explosion to come. Walter Greene had always believed that the strength of a family lay in the bonds of trust. It was a conviction forged during years of military service, where loyalty and integrity meant the difference between survival and collapse. But in the weeks that followed the arrival of the DNA results, trust inside the Greene household was replaced with suspicion, bitterness, and silence. Margaret's denials did nothing to soothe him. If anything, they inflamed the wound. She waved away the test results, insisting that the companies made mistakes, that numbers on a page could not erase the decades of love they had shared. But for Walter, those words rang hollow. The paper was not just numbers. It was proof, evidence of betrayal so deep it could not be dismissed with a shrug or a prayer. Walter carried the report in his pocket like a weapon, folded and creased from constant handling. He read it over and over, memorizing the damning figures, as if repetition might force him to find a loophole that did not exist. Each time he looked at the 0% next to his children's names, his stomach twisted tighter. The house that had once been a place of warmth grew cold. Meals at the table became tense, with conversations cut short and glances exchanged that carried unspoken accusations. The laughter that had once filled the Greene home vanished. Even the walls seemed to echo differently, as if the house itself understood the fracture that had taken place. David, the eldest, tried to push forward as though nothing had changed. After their confrontation, he returned less frequently, making excuses about work or errands. Lisa, ever the peacemaker, sensed the tension but did not know its cause. She called her father more often, her voice soft, asking if he was doing all right. Walter would answer politely, but his words were clipped, his tone edged with a bitterness she could not place. Marcus noticed too, though in his own way. When he came by, he tried to lighten the air with jokes, but his father's laughter no longer came. Instead, Walter would watch him silently, eyes narrowed, as though measuring something unseen. And Jasmine, the one who had given him the kit in the first place, felt the change most sharply. Her father, once so warm toward her, now seemed withdrawn, his eyes heavy with a sadness that frightened her. Margaret attempted to carry on as if the house were not collapsing. She kept cooking, humming hymns under her breath, setting the table as though rituals could hold the family together. But Walter could not look at her without remembering the betrayal. He replayed her dismissals in his mind, her refusal to admit what the paper revealed. He began to wonder not just who his children's fathers were, but how many lies Margaret had told to keep the secret buried. The tension grew heavier each day, building like a storm that refused to break. Walter became restless, pacing the house at night, unable to sleep. He found himself staring at old photographs, questioning everything they depicted. The family trips, the birthday parties, the graduations, all moments he had cherished now felt tainted, reinterpreted through the lens of betrayal. Neighbors began to notice a change in him. The once steady veteran, always ready with a nod or wave, now moved with a distracted air. His morning walks grew shorter. He no longer lingered on the porch. His presence at church became infrequent. When asked if everything was all right, Walter would force a smile and say he was fine. But those who looked closely could see the truth. Something inside him was unraveling. At home, arguments flared. Walter pressed Margaret again and again for answers, each time meeting the same wall of denial. She clung to her insistence that the test was wrong, that he was letting paranoia poison him. "You raised them, Walter," she would say, her voice trembling. "They're yours. That's what matters." But Walter could not accept it. To him, fatherhood was built not just on love but on truth. And the truth, he believed, had been stolen from him. Eventually, the tension reached the children. David, though still skeptical of the DNA test, could not ignore the way his father's anger seeped into every conversation. Lisa grew distressed at the coldness she sensed but could not explain. Marcus tried to brush it off, but even he felt the strain. And Jasmine, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of love, pleaded with her father to let it go, to remember that family was more than blood. Walter listened but said little. He could not escape the numbers, the betrayal etched into every interaction. When he looked at his children, he no longer saw only the people he had raised. He saw reminders of Margaret's secrets, faces that now carried questions he could not answer. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, Walter called his children together under the pretense of a family meeting. They gathered in the living room, the air thick with unease. Margaret sat stiffly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Walter stood before them, holding the crumpled report in his hand. "I took a DNA test," he said, his voice low but steady. "It says I'm not your father. Not one of you." The words fell heavy, like stones dropped into water. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "What are you talking about, Daddy? That can't be true." Marcus shook his head, pacing. "Come on, this has to be some kind of mistake." Jasmine covered her mouth, her face pale. And David, though shaken, tried to speak with reason. "Dad, we talked about this. Those tests aren't perfect. You're letting it get to you. You're our father. End of story." But then, Margaret spoke. Her voice was sharp, defensive. "Walter, stop this. You were always gone. Off fighting wars, leaving me alone. Do you know what it's like to raise children by yourself?" Her words pierced the room like a knife. The children turned to her in shock, their faces shifting from confusion to horror. Lisa began to sob openly. Marcus shouted, "What are you saying, Mama? Did you?" Margaret's voice faltered. I don't know. I just don't know." Walter stood silently, his chest heaving, his fists clenched. In that moment, the truth was no longer just numbers on a page. It was spoken aloud, undeniable. His wife of 50 years had betrayed him, and his children, his pride, his legacy, were not his own. The Greene family, once admired by neighbors as a symbol of resilience and love, was in shambles. And for Walter, the tension that had been building for weeks hardened into something darker. The man who had built his life on discipline and control now stood on the edge of losing both. The storm inside him was no longer just brewing. It was preparing to break. By the time weeks had passed since the Greene family's disastrous living room meeting, Walter Greene was no longer the same man his community had known. The quiet dignity that once defined him had hardened into silence. His steps grew slower, his gaze sharper, his voice less patient. Neighbors who waved at him now received little more than a distracted nod. Those closest to him, his children and his wife, felt the chill most. The Greene home, once filled with warmth and laughter, was now a place of unspoken accusations. Margaret attempted to carry on, clinging to routines that had once grounded their family life. She prepared meals, folded laundry, and set the table as if these rituals could glue the pieces back together. But Walter ate little, and his presence at the table was a looming shadow rather than a comforting anchor. Walter's anger was not loud. It brewed quietly, like a storm gathering strength beneath still skies. His military discipline kept him from screaming, but not from stewing. At night, when Margaret was asleep, he would sit in the darkened living room, the DNA report clutched in his hands. The words replayed in his mind until they were no longer just letters on a page but a mantra of betrayal. 0%. 0%. 0%. He began to withdraw from church. He avoided social gatherings. The porch where he once greeted neighbors became abandoned. Instead, he paced inside the house, consumed by thoughts he could not shake. If Margaret had betrayed him, who else had known? Had the whispers he dismissed decades ago, those rumors spoken in hushed tones during his deployments, been true all along? The name that haunted him most was Robert Collins. Robert had been a fixture in their lives for as long as Walter could remember. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, attended the same church, and shared meals at the same tables. Robert was trusted enough to be around the Greene children, welcomed into the home as a family friend. But trust, Walter now realized, had been misplaced. He began to notice details he had long ignored. Marcus's smile that resembled Robert's more than his own. The way Robert and Margaret exchanged knowing glances at community events. Memories once dismissed as harmless suddenly took on sinister meaning. Walter confronted Margaret again, demanding the truth. His questions were sharp, his voice low and dangerous. Margaret, cornered, broke her silence in fragments. She admitted to loneliness during his deployments. She spoke of needs and of finding comfort in others. But she never gave him clarity. She refused to name names, to give him the closure he so desperately sought. Her evasions enraged him more than outright confession would have. For Walter, the absence of answers was torture. He became obsessed with uncovering the truth himself. He questioned his children indirectly, searching their faces for traits that did not belong to him. He scrutinized old photographs, looking for resemblances that now seemed glaring. Each discovery fed his obsession, confirming in his mind that Robert Collins had not only betrayed him as a friend but stolen from him the most precious thing a man could have, his family. The breaking point came when Margaret suggested they meet with Robert. She believed a conversation might clear the air, ease Walter's paranoia, and perhaps bring some peace. "Robert wants to talk," she said carefully one evening. "We can sit down, all of us. Maybe it will help." To her, it was an act of reconciliation. To Walter, it was confirmation. Robert wanted to talk because Robert had something to hide. Walter agreed to the meeting, but his silence unsettled Margaret. There was something in the way he carried himself, something cold and unreadable. He no longer looked like a man seeking answers. He looked like a man preparing for judgment. The evening of the meeting arrived with heavy skies, rain threatening on the horizon. Walter drove to Robert's home, where several family members were already gathered. Margaret was there, along with 3 of the children, Lisa, Marcus, and Jasmine. They hoped to calm Walter, to convince him that blood did not erase a lifetime of love. Robert greeted him with unease, his usual confidence absent. Walter's eyes never left him. His presence filled the room, towering, silent, unyielding. The air was thick with tension. Margaret tried to mediate, her voice trembling as she asked Walter to sit, to listen, to talk. But Walter wanted none of it. His focus was on Robert. "Step outside," Walter said, his voice low but sharp. Robert shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the others. "This isn't the time, Walter. Let's sit down. We can talk in here." "Outside. Now." Margaret's voice broke through. "Walter, please. You're making a scene." Walter turned his head slowly toward her, his eyes cold. "We'll settle this," he said, "once and for all." The family froze. The weight of his words, the tension in his voice, made the air feel electric. Robert, reluctantly, moved toward the door. Walter followed. Outside on the porch, the confrontation finally began. Rain pattered lightly on the roof, thunder rolling in the distance. "You think I don't know?" Walter's voice was quiet, controlled, but seething with rage. "You think I don't know what you did to me? To my family?" Robert lifted his hands defensively. "Walter, we've been friends a long time. You're letting this get in your head. I never meant." "Friends?" Walter let out a bitter laugh. "You sat at my table, ate my food, smiled at my children, knowing one or more of them might be yours. You call that friendship?" Robert swallowed hard, his voice faltering. "It wasn't like that." But Walter was no longer listening. The betrayal had consumed him. In his mind, Robert had not only betrayed his trust but had stolen the very essence of his identity. The breaking point had arrived. Decades of discipline, of quiet endurance, had given way to fury. What happened next would transform Walter Greene from a man admired by his town into a man whispered about in courtrooms and news reports. The storm inside him had finally broken. The night Walter Greene arrived at Robert Collins's house, the air was already thick with tension. A storm hovered on the horizon, clouds rolling across the Mississippi sky, the kind of weather that seemed to mirror the turmoil brewing inside Walter himself. He parked his truck in the gravel driveway, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in silence. Through the front window, he could see the faint glow of lamps, the silhouettes of his family gathered inside. Margaret had insisted this meeting might heal wounds. But Walter carried with him no hope for reconciliation. He had come for answers, and he suspected the truth would not come freely. When he stepped inside, the atmosphere was uneasy. Robert stood in the living room, shifting on his feet, a forced smile plastered across his face. Margaret was there too, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression strained. 3 of Walter's children, Lisa, Marcus, and Jasmine, were seated nearby, watching with nervous eyes. Their father's silence, his rigid posture, unsettled them more than raised voices ever could. Walter did not bother with greetings. His gaze locked on Robert, and the room seemed to shrink around them. Margaret spoke first, her voice thin and trembling. "Walter, please, let's sit down. We can talk through this, like a family." But Walter's voice cut through her plea, low and sharp. "Step outside," he said to Robert. Robert hesitated, glancing around the room. "Now isn't the time, Walter. Let's sit, have a meal, talk this out here." "Outside," Walter repeated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The children shifted uncomfortably. Lisa reached for her father's arm, but he brushed past her, his eyes never leaving Robert. Margaret's voice rose again, tinged with desperation. "Walter, please. You're making a scene." Walter turned his head slightly toward her, his expression cold. "We'll settle this once and for all." The words hung heavy in the air. Margaret fell silent, her breath shallow. Robert sighed, resigned, and walked toward the porch. Walter followed, his steps steady, deliberate. The 2 men stood face to face on the wooden porch, rain beginning to fall in light drops that tapped against the railing. Thunder rumbled in the distance. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Walter broke the silence. "You think I don't know?" His voice was quiet, but the weight of it carried. "You think I don't know what you did to me? To my family?" Robert shifted uncomfortably. "Walter, we've been friends a long time. Don't do this. You're letting your mind get twisted. That test." "Friends?" Walter interrupted, his laugh bitter. "You sat in my house, ate at my table, smiled at my children, all while knowing one, or more, of them might be yours. That's what you call friendship." Robert lifted his hand slightly, as if to calm him. "It wasn't like that. I never tried to take your place. Whatever happened, it was between Margaret and me. It doesn't change the fact that those kids love you. You're their father, Walter. Everyone knows that." But the words offered no comfort. To Walter, they were an admission, not a defense. His chest tightened as decades of suppressed doubts and ignored whispers surged to the surface. Inside the house, Margaret and the children leaned close to the window, their faces pale. They could not hear every word, but they could see the confrontation unfolding. Walter's voice grew colder. "You stole from me, Robert. You stole my blood, my name, my legacy. While I was breaking my back serving this country, you were here, undoing everything I built." Robert's face drained of color. He stepped back, his eyes darting toward the doorway where Margaret stood. "Margaret, tell him. Tell him it wasn't like that." But Margaret said nothing. Her silence was louder than any confession. Walter's breathing grew heavier, his fists clenched at his sides. "For 50 years, I lived a lie. And you were part of it. You let me raise children who weren't mine. Let me believe I had something real." "Walter," Robert said, his voice shaking now, "think about what you're saying. Think about your children. This won't change the past. It'll only destroy what's left." But Walter was past reason. His mind was consumed by betrayal, his identity fractured beyond repair. In that moment, Robert was no longer just a man. He was the embodiment of every lie, every humiliation, every sacrifice that had been mocked by deception. Inside, Margaret cried out, begging Walter to come back inside. Lisa clutched Jasmine's hand, while Marcus stood frozen, his jaw clenched. None of them moved. The rain grew heavier, streaking across the porch as thunder cracked above. Walter's eyes burned with a mix of rage and grief. Robert took another step back, his voice trembling. "Walter, please. You don't want to do this." But it was too late. The breaking point had passed. The sharp sound that followed shattered the night, echoing across the quiet street. Neighbors would later say they heard it through the storm, a crack that silenced the crickets and sent dogs barking. When Margaret and the children rushed onto the porch, they found Robert collapsed, his body crumpled against the railing. Walter stood over him, his expression eerily calm. The fury that had consumed him moments earlier was gone, replaced by a chilling emptiness. He looked down at Robert, then at his family, who stood frozen in shock. "What did you do?" Jasmine whispered, her voice breaking. Walter's reply was steady, almost detached. What needed to be done? The storm broke fully then, rain pouring down in sheets. Margaret sobbed uncontrollably, her cries carrying through the night. The children clung to one another, torn between grief and disbelief. Walter did not flee. He did not protest. He stood silently on the porch, waiting. When the flashing lights of police cars cut through the darkness, he raised his hands without resistance. Neighbors gathered on the street, whispering in shock. The respected veteran, the man who had been a pillar of their community, was led away in handcuffs. As he sat in the back of the squad car, rain streaking down the windows, Walter stared into the distance. He did not speak. He did not look back at the home he had once cherished. In his silence, there was only resignation, the knowledge that his life, his family, and his legacy had been shattered beyond repair. The confrontation that had begun with words ended with a single irrevocable act, and the town of Brookhaven would never see Walter Greene the same way again. When the rain finally stopped that night in Brookhaven, the Greene home no longer looked like a place of comfort. The porch where family had once gathered now carried the weight of a tragedy the entire town would soon hear about. Police cars lined the street, their flashing lights illuminating the faces of neighbors who had emerged from their homes, whispering in disbelief. Walter Greene, who had stood silently as officers placed cuffs around his wrists, was led down the steps without resistance. He did not speak, did not struggle. His eyes remained forward, his face calm, as though the storm that had raged inside him for weeks had finally burned itself out. To those watching, the sight was almost more disturbing than the crime itself. The respected veteran, the man who had lived among them as a symbol of dignity, appeared unshaken, even resigned. Inside the house, Margaret collapsed into a chair, her body trembling. Lisa wept openly, clinging to her sister Jasmine, while Marcus stood motionless, staring at the empty porch where his father had stood only moments earlier. For them, the reality was almost too much to grasp. In the span of minutes, their family had been destroyed, one man dead, another taken away in handcuffs, and their mother's silence exposing a betrayal too deep to reconcile. The police report, filed that night, was simple. An altercation had taken place between Walter Greene and Robert Collins. Witnesses described heated words exchanged, followed by a sudden act that ended Robert's life. Walter did not flee the scene. He surrendered peacefully, stating only that it had to be done. The news spread quickly. By morning, Brookhaven was buzzing. At the diner, in the church pews, on the sidewalks, people spoke in hushed tones about the man they thought they knew. For decades, Walter had been the veteran with a steady hand, the neighbor you could count on. Now, his name was tied to murder. The investigation moved swiftly. Detectives interviewed Margaret and the Greene children, gathering the history that had led to the confrontation. The DNA test results were entered into evidence, though they played no direct role in the charge itself. What mattered legally was simple. A man was dead, and Walter had admitted responsibility. But to those who followed the case, the story was never that simple. This was not a crime born of greed or chance. It was a crime born of secrets, secrets buried for half a century, revealed only by science and a single birthday gift. Walter was charged with first-degree murder. He was transported to the county jail, where he awaited trial. The veteran who had once commanded respect now sat in a cell, his reputation dismantled, his legacy in ruins. Fellow inmates watched him curiously, some recognizing his name from the news. Walter rarely spoke. He spent most of his time seated on his bunk, staring at the wall, as though replaying the events that had brought him there. For Margaret, the weeks that followed were unbearable. Friends she had once leaned on for support now avoided her. Whispers followed her at the grocery store. Neighbors who had once greeted her warmly now turned away. She became a pariah, blamed not only for her infidelity but for the chain of events that had ended in bloodshed. She denied details when pressed, offering little clarity even to her own children. Her silence deepened the divide, leaving Lisa, Marcus, and Jasmine to wonder how much of their lives had been built on lies. David, the eldest, distanced himself. Though he had once defended his father against the DNA test, he could not reconcile the man who raised him with the man now accused of murder. He withdrew from his siblings, retreating into his own life, avoiding both the courthouse and the family home. The trial began months later, drawing crowds from across the county. Reporters filled the courtroom, their pens ready to capture the fall of a man once celebrated. The prosecution argued the case plainly. Walter Greene had deliberately taken Robert Collins's life. The defense painted a different picture, one of a man broken by betrayal, whose judgment had collapsed under the weight of humiliation and deceit. Witness testimony was harrowing. Margaret, called to the stand, spoke in fragmented sentences, her voice breaking as she described her husband's growing anger in the weeks after the DNA results. She admitted to mistakes during his deployments but avoided specifics, unwilling, or unable, to say Robert's name in connection with her children. Her evasions frustrated the courtroom but revealed enough to paint a picture of infidelity that had stretched back decades. The Greene children were divided in their responses. Lisa sobbed as she recounted the night of the confrontation, describing her father's cold words and her mother's silence. Marcus, his voice shaking with anger, expressed disbelief that a man of such discipline could allow rage to control him. Jasmine, torn between loyalty and horror, pleaded for understanding, describing her father as a man pushed past the limits of endurance. The jury listened, their faces grim. They were not asked to decide whether Walter had been betrayed. They were asked only to decide whether his act was murder. After 2 weeks of testimony and deliberation, the verdict was read. Guilty of first-degree murder. Walter stood silently as the judge delivered the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. He nodded once, his face expressionless. To observers, it seemed as though he had already accepted his fate long before the words were spoken. The fallout for the Greene family was devastating. Margaret, ostracized by the community, withdrew almost entirely from public life. Lisa struggled to maintain a sense of normalcy, but her faith in family was shattered. Marcus grew resentful, distancing himself from both parents. Jasmine visited her father in prison, but each visit left her more broken, torn between love for the man who raised her and grief for the man who had destroyed everything. For Brookhaven, the case became a cautionary tale, retold in whispers at church gatherings and over coffee at the diner. It was a reminder that even the most respected lives could hide secrets darker than anyone imagined. The veteran who had once been a symbol of honor was now remembered for a single act that destroyed not only a life but an entire family. Years later, those who still remembered Walter Greene spoke of him with sadness. Some argued he was a man pushed too far, broken by betrayal. Others insisted he had chosen violence, and that nothing could excuse it. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, a man, a secret, and a choice that could not be undone. In the end, the Greene family was left with ashes. Their name, once spoken with respect, now carried the weight of tragedy. For Walter, his legacy as a soldier, a father, and a neighbor was replaced by the story of a man whose life unraveled because of truths hidden too long. And for those who watched from the outside, the case left one haunting question. When the foundation of a life is built on lies, what happens when the truth finally surfaces?